My name is Peter Medgyes, and I'm a non-native English-speaking teacher and teacher trainer from Hungary, and I'm speaking from Budapest at the moment. The aim of this short presentation is to introduce the third edition of my book, The Non-Native Teacher, and this is the third edition, which means that there must have been a first and a second edition too. The first edition came out in 1994 by Macmillan, and I won in 1995 the Duke of Edinburgh Book Prize for the best methodology book. The second edition came 5 years later. It was published in 1999 by Huber Verlag, the German publisher. Unfortunately, both the first and the second editions went out of print a few years after they'd been published. Now the question arises, why write the third edition? Well, there are several reasons for this. One of them is that colleagues have been asking for this book, and it was very difficult to find the book. And another reason is that it's still a very hot topic, even hotter perhaps than it was when it was first published in the 1990s. So I believe that it warrants further discussion. And a third reason may be that there have been a lot of developments since the first edition. About a dozen books have been published, hundreds of papers, relevant papers on the same topic have also come out. And maybe the last reason for the third edition is that I wanted to turn research into practice, theory into practice. That's why I designed a lot of tasks, activities for class use in pre-service and in-service training, but also for self-study purposes, for continuing professional development. The publisher of the book is Susan Holden of Swan Communication, and the distributor of the book is the English Language Bookshop at Brighton. Now, you may find it interesting that the book actually was printed in two colors. As you can see it, there is the black print, and there is the blue print in the margin. Why this? Well, the black one contains the original text. Okay, there have been a few typos which I've deleted, but otherwise it's more or less the same as it came out for the first edition. Now, the blue part, which is mostly in the margins, provides the new material. Each chapter begins with focus points to trigger ideas. Then there are margin notes to provide activities for discussion and awareness-raising exercises. And finally, at the end of each chapter, you will find further reading to offer current titles of relevance, which I believe are worth reading. The first question that may arise is, why give this book the title The Non-Native Teacher? There are a lot of colleagues who would query and call into doubt the legitimacy of this separation of the native and the non-native speaker, and by extension, the separation of non-native and native English-speaking teachers. Well, I realize that there is a bit of truth in this, but people, and teachers in particular, still use this distinction, even though I believe the terms defy clear-cut definitions. And I believe that even though there are in-between cases, there are people who, for example, were born from a Hungarian mother and a Venezuelan father. Now, okay, what is the mother tongue of that child? That's true. But I believe that 90% of us fall into either this or that category. And I also decided to retain this separation for the sake of convenience, simply. Now, let me say a few words about the book structure. It is symmetrically arranged. It consists of 6 parts, and each part contains 2 chapters. So altogether, there are 12 chapters. There is a foreword, which was written by a fellow non-native English-speaking teacher, who I would call, again for the sake of convenience, Non-Nest Silvana Richardson from Argentina. Part 1 asked the question, why English? How come that English has become the lingua franca of the world of the 20th and the 21st century? Who is a native speaker anyway? So this is that I am elaborating on in the first part. In the second part, I would shift the focus from the native speaker to the native teacher, that is the nest and the non-nest. Part 3 carries the central message of the book. I believe that we non-nests have both a dark side and a bright side. The dark side is, and I think it's quite trivial, is that our language competence is not on a par with the native speakers. Therefore, a lot of us are a little bit stressed because of this deficiency. Some of us even develop schizophrenia, in inverted commas, or inferiority complex. Okay, this is the dark side, but I think it's much more interesting to talk about the bright side of being non-nest. I believe I advanced 6 hypotheses, 6 assumptions, whereby I believe that we non-nests can offset this deficiency. The first one is that I believe that we can provide a better learning model, not a better language model, obviously, but a better learner model, simply because we had to go through the same process of acquiring or learning English as a foreign language. My second assumption is that we can teach language learning strategies more effectively than our native peers. Thirdly, we can provide, I suppose, a lot more information about the English language because we know what the difficulties of the English language are. Fourthly, we can better anticipate language deficiencies, language difficulties that the learners have to grapple with. Therefore, we can also prevent errors, perhaps more effectively than our native colleagues. Fifthly, I believe that we can show more empathy towards our learners because we know a lot more about them than our native peers, especially when we are teaching a monolingual group and we share the same language one. And finally, and I think this is the most obvious thing, is that we share the language one with our learners. So if the worst comes to the worst, we can translate the English word for our learners to understand into our shared mother tongue. So this was part 3. Part 4 clinches the debate, if I may use this term. The question arises, who's worth more, the native or the non-native? And my answer is neither. There is no such thing as a better teacher or a worse teacher simply on the basis of being a native or a non-native speaker. Then another question is, who is the ideal nest and the ideal non-nest? Well, it can be either, but each in our own ways. We are equal, but different. So, what is the ideal situation then? I think the ideal situation is where there's a fair balance between natives and non-natives, nests and non-nests, each of us offering our assets to the learners. And of course, if we can collaborate with one another, that's the ideal situation. Part 5 offers practical ideas and activities for non-nest to develop their language proficiency in and outside the classroom. And finally, part 6 contains 2 papers that I've co-authored in recent years with my colleagues. Of course, the book ends with appendices. There are over 300 references. There is a subject and a name index, and a short dialogue between publisher Susan Holden and me under the title Looking Ahead. So, in conclusion, my sympathy, to be quite honest, lies with my colleagues, non-nest colleagues. Why? Well, partly because we are in majority. 97% of English teachers are non-nest. And nevertheless, there is still relatively little written on our specific problems, even though they are far more daunting than the problems that native English teachers have to come to grips with. There's even today, there's been relatively less written by non-nests. Most of the papers and books relating to this subject come out written by natives. And finally, I'm a non-nest too. So what else can you expect? Happy reading.